Hi ladies, it's great to be back with you for this fourth and final segment of our study of 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Some of the topics we've looked at are gentleness, God's power to change us, the weapons of His Word that we can use in spiritual battle, the 7 lies we believe about God, the fact that we have everything we need for the spiritual battle, and how we need not to focus on things how they look outwardly. Let's continue the study in verse 12. I'll read, "For we're not bold to class or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. But when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding." Another way to say the first part of that verse, we're not bold to class or compare ourselves, is to say we don't dare compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. Paul's being very forceful here. He and his co-workers would never compare themselves with these false teachers. Why? Well, you can just hear the disgust in Paul's voice. Because they compare themselves with themselves. And what does Paul say people like this are? The nice word in this translation are, they're without understanding. I think a better way to say this is, they're stupid. People who compare themselves with themselves are stupid. That's Rodham's translation. Have you ever known anyone like this? I've known a few people like this in my life, and it's the one quality I absolutely detest in people. What's the quality? Well, when I first read this chapter to teach it, I wrote in the margin of my Bible the word smug. I hate smugness. People who are satisfied with themselves in a condescending way. I'm talking about people who are just so happy with themselves and their accomplishments, that's all they need. Now, I'm not saying that you don't take pride in yourselves or in your work. Not at all. God took pride in His creation when He said, and it was good. I'm also not talking about contentment. I'm content with my life and circumstances, but what I'm talking about is more an attitude of superiority. These people thought they were the highest standard, and Paul says that's stupid. We know who the higher standard is, and it ain't us. Paul goes on in verse 13, "But we will not boast beyond our measure, but within the measure of the sphere which God apportioned to us, as a measure to reach even as far as you." These next few verses may not be something you have much experience with, but as a missionary, I totally understand this. Unfortunately, this is an issue in missions, especially church planting. When conflicts arise between teammates, sometimes workers argue over the people with whom they've invested. I remember the first time I saw it, I was shocked. We knew several workers in another organization, and when one of them decided to leave and go work for another group in the same country, they were told by their previous teammates they could no longer contact or work with the nationals that they had previously worked with. I couldn't believe it. But that's kind of what's happening here. Paul is saying that, hey, I have the right to speak into this church's life because God put me in a position of influence here. I'm not overextending or reaching into an area I don't belong. I started this church, for crying out loud. That's my translation. Paul put it this way in verse 14. "For we're not overextending ourselves as if we did not reach to you, for we were the first to come, even as far as you in the gospel of Christ." Paul points out they were the first ones to come to Corinth, and that these new ministers were the ones encroaching on his ministry and overextending themselves, not the other way around. As verse 15 says, "Not boasting beyond our measure," that is, in other men's labors. But Paul goes on to explain that he doesn't want the church to stop growing. He shares what his hopes are for the Corinthian church in the second part of verse 15 and then verse 16. "But with the hope that as your faith grows, we will be within our sphere enlarged even by you, so as to preach the gospel even to regions beyond you, and not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another." Paul, the ultimate church planner, is always looking where he can expand next. Where can we plant another church? Who else can we reach? He wants to take the gospel beyond the Corinthians. And so Paul, as well as the church, would be enlarged even more. And that he would not be boasting inappropriately or about someone else's work, but it would be related to his work. We've seen this in Bulgaria. Scott works with a pastor from another country who started many churches among the Roma there. It's a direct result from this man's labors. And when these churches expand and plant new churches, these new churches come under his supervision as well. This is a normal process, and that's the point Paul is trying to make. He closes in verse 17 and 18 with, "But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. For it is not he who commends himself who's approved, but he whom the Lord commends." Paul circles back to verse 12 where he talked about these new teachers were commending themselves. I read in one commentary that both Greeks and Jews used comparison as a rhetorical device, like in the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, which Jesus told in Luke 18, where the two of them are being compared. That passage begins with this explanation of why Jesus told the parable. Starting in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, "And he told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt." Jesus also dealt with people who commended themselves by comparing themselves with themselves, namely the Pharisees. But it's pointless to endorse a ministry based on self-commendation. It's like a thief telling a judge, "Oh, you can believe me." And when the judge asks, "Why should I believe you?" he answers, "Well, I don't lie." And the judge says, "Well, how do I know you don't lie?" And he answers, "Because I'm not a liar." It doesn't work that way. Paul here is not basing his commendation on himself. He's basing it on the church. Their existence is Paul's endorsement, and the fact that the Lord approves him. And this is the point we can take away from this. Paul didn't commend himself, and he wasn't looking for the approval or commendation of others. His eyes were fixed on the Lord. As the phrase goes, he had an audience of one. And we see this as his consistent message as he shares in 1 Corinthians 10:31. "Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." May that represent our lives every day. Say it with me as we close. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Amen.